Kimberly. We just had a talk before a little bit to prep. But since I know you very well, I'd still like you to introduce yourself and the company you're working for, and obviously also your journey to remote working.
Excellent. Really happy to be chatting with you about this topic. So I'm Kimberly Bringas. I'm the Senior HR Manager at Olark, and Olark is currently a 100% remote company, and we are a live chat company. We've been around 10 years now. We're actually celebrating our 10-year anniversary, which is a really big deal. And we've been remote pretty much from the start. Our founders did come out to California and got some fundings, did the startup life. And after a bit, one of the founders decided, this isn't for me. California's not my thing. I really want to move back to Michigan. And so he did that. So remote's been in our DNA from the very beginning. So when I joined, almost 5 years ago, we used to have two offices. We had a San Francisco office and an Ann Arbor office. And I was in charge of managing the SF office in person, but then the Ann Arbor office remotely as well. But around 2000, probably 16, 17, it's a little blurred. We started to notice there was this kind of drop off in attendance from actually going to the office. So it was a mix of either people left the company or they just weren't coming in as much, or they moved away from the office. So it just didn't make sense for them to come in. So it started this, very in-depth discussion of, okay, well, we always talk about being remote first, and remote is a big part of our company. Does this mean we should start thinking about maybe we don't need offices anymore? So it first started with our San Francisco office. Now, for anyone who's in San Francisco, real estate costs are pretty steep. And so after a while, it just came to the conclusion that for the amount of attendance we actually were having, financially, it just didn't make sense. So around the beginning of 2017, I actually closed our SF office. And from there, we started also noticing around the same time that our Ann Arbor office was also, lower attendance, lower use rate. So from there, we then started talking about, well, okay, maybe the Ann Arbor office needs to close as well. But then the big question became, well, what parts go into closing a last office to then become 100% remote? Now, as far as best practices, guidebooks, anything, there was nothing. So it essentially became one of the most highly collaborative projects I've ever managed, mainly because one of the things I would have loved to have known, which I couldn't possibly have known because there's just not a ton of examples of this happening, is the efforts it takes and the expertise that you need in order to do it. So what's nice is now that I know, I can impart this wisdom. So hopefully anybody who's listening will not struggle nearly as much as I did. So I was very fortunate that around this time when I was looking at closing our last office, we have a finance firm in place that we work with. We have great lawyers. Shout out to Silicon Legal Strategy. They're amazing. Great working with. And also we have TriNet. So essentially the big question became, since at the time we were using Earth Class Mail, which is a virtual mailbox. So essentially you can set it up. It's a real address. You send your mail there, they scan it for you, and they send you scanned copies to your email. And they can also do things like deposit checks for you. It's actually it's kind of an all-in-one. So then the question became, well, okay, we have this virtual mailbox. Can we convert our HQ address to a virtual mailbox? So I looked at, did Google searches, asked around. I didn't find anything that said 1,000%, yeah, do it. There was no track record history of anything like that. So I leaned on our experts. So I asked our finance firm, I asked our lawyers, I asked TriNet, I'm like, is there any legal red flags with converting our HQ address to a virtual mailbox? Any possible problems with that? And so after a while, because they had to do their due diligence and look on my behalf and use their expertise, and each one came back saying, nope, it looks like this will be fine. You can totally do it this way. So it was this really intense effort of just like kind of checking everything, because I'm definitely one who likes to do my due diligence. I don't like to just start something without knowing if there's any legal, financial, pitfalls that I can fall into. I try to figure out as many of those beforehand. So yeah, that was kind of the big question we had to answer. Luckily, the answer was yes. So we set up, and then it became like, okay, finance firm, I have set up our virtual address. It's all good to go. And then it was coordinating, because as of now, we have employees in 15 different states. So it was their effort of making sure our address changes happen and make sure on the finance side, our legal, I was corresponding with them about mainly, are there any documents or anything we have to, update that have this new address? And then with TriNet, essentially doing an internal audit, making sure everybody's remote address is matched up the way they're supposed to, especially since we were closing the Ann Arbor office. I had to switch all of those people that were tied to that HQ address to a remote location. So it was a lot of like internal coordination. And it took almost a year from start to finish of just like figuring out what needed to be done. And then the actual office closure, which even with my experience, because I used to work at Groupon as their office managers, and I did, I think, 6 office moves, closures, mixes of that, like nothing prepared me for the level of complication. Now that's to say it's totally doable, right? It's just one of those things that my biggest recommendation is, if this is something that you're highly interested in doing, making sure you have the right team in place. So kind of at a bare minimum, you should have really good lawyers. You should have an accountant CPA who's comfortable with maybe filing or doing things in different states, and also at a federal level. If you are a small company, an HR provider, like TriNet, for instance, can actually save you a lot of time, because they will file a bunch of things on your behalf. And then most importantly, an internal person to kind of manage all of that. So I don't want to sugarcoat it and say like, yeah, it's super easy, you can get it done. But with the right people in place and giving yourself a realistic timeline, I would say minimum a year if you're transitioning to wanting to close your last offices. It'll just reduce the stress, and also just give your team time to kind of acclimate to kind of this new setting. Like, especially if maybe you're not in the same case as us where attendance was low, people were leaving, people weren't using the office. So when we told them, hey, we're thinking of doing this, and we gave them plenty of notice, they're like, yeah, it makes sense. Like, I only go in maybe once or twice a week, if even that. Right. So for the people that were even like using it, they're like, this makes sense to me. Like, and there wasn't like this huge backlash. But for maybe a situation where maybe there are more people going into an office, like also giving yourself time can kind of help ease people into that change and transition.
Absolutely. And it sounds like it's almost always like this, right? That the administrative backlash of something like a structural change is usually almost worse than what happens with your team. And you said remote was baked into Olark's DNA at the beginning, so it wasn't something that was introduced as an entirely new idea. So kind of the perspective that we're looking at here is a company that is clearly already comfortable with remote working, with some people occasionally coming into an office, but also some people that just never showed up to the office, right? Mm-hmm. So in terms of your company culture, I would assume not that much has changed. Would you say from the closure, when was it, 2018 probably then, right?
Correct, yeah, October 2018.
Almost a year.
My boss and I went in and rolled up our sleeves and got it closed. Yeah, definitely when it's built in, it's that transition, if anything, is seamless. Like one of the questions you had was about, did it change our hiring, for instance? And the thing is Mandy, my director, being the smart lady that she is, actually kind of removed this way early, because when she was brought on, one of the things she wanted to remove was, like, before we used to have as our final round work along was fly the people out to work with us in person. And she brought up a really good point. She's like, the vast majority of the time we're not working in person, this doesn't make any sense. Like, let's make the work alone remote, use the tools that we normally use. And she was 100% correct. So essentially that last sort of component was gone before I think even discussions of closing the office even happened. So in some senses, we were already kind of laying the groundwork, maybe not consciously, of just like making that transition because we were leaning so hard into remote anyways.
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes complete sense. So it's good to hear, obviously, your hiring process transformed over time. But yeah, since your interviews weren't in person anymore, it was only the work along, I think, then it's definitely a lot easier to just, set up the expectation for people to say, like, you know what, like, we will hire you without seeing you face to face, which is, you have to have a good hiring process in place to sort of say that with confidence, right? So that speaks definitely to Olark that you guys have managed to do that, and that you can build a level of trust with the tools and with the processes that you have in place. And that's pretty awesome. Circling back a little bit to the moment when you had to sort of formally decide on remote working policies. I remember we've had a previous conversation, and I was so fascinated by the consistency with which you guys have approached people in, yes, you have different states in the US, you mentioned that, but we also said earlier, Canada is where you have employees on payroll. And then outside of those two countries, you have contractors that would go as far as Europe. So clearly you had to make some decisions on what is possible, what is not possible, and what are the maybe differences between someone in the US and someone in Europe.
Yeah, so you really nailed it, that one of the things we try to focus on a lot is consistency. Now, I use the word consistency very purposely, mainly because I don't like using the word fair, because fair is very subjective, where consistency is kind of based on what's available, right? So we are restricted, for instance, that, a contractor versus an employee, legally, there are just things we cannot do, right? And so for us, it always came down to, okay, we can't have everyone 100% the same. That's just not doable. But whenever we're looking at, a policy change or incorporating something in, we try to think about, okay, how can we make this as consistent as possible? But whenever we don't give something, being very clear as to the why. So even within the handbook that, I've written, or whenever there's an announcement about something, I specifically ping, let's say, our contractors, for instance, to say, I just want to make it really clear that, this is not a contractor, thing that I can give you because of X, Y, and Z. And for me, whenever there's that transparency, the response I usually get is maybe a few additional questions. But for the most part, they're like, great, thanks for letting me know that. And for the most part, especially like our contractors, they understand because we've been very transparent from them from the beginning. And so one of the things, for instance, like when we look at, we can't give them, benefits, for instance. So instead we bake it into their, monthly contractor rates. So give them a little bit more, which is totally fine. It's not technically a benefit, but it's a way to kind of like make them a little bit more on par with everybody else that is an employee. So it's kind of finding these like workarounds at times. Again, it's not going to be 100% the same, but the effort is there, showing like, we're trying to, be as consistent as we can be, and this is how we did it. And for the most part, I mean, the response I usually get back is just gratitude of like, thank you for thinking, beyond this, and not just saying, well, sorry, we can't do that. Usually the response I give them is, I'm not sure if I can do that. Let me look into that for you. And then from there, that's where my outside experts are really great, because I can check things with them. Like I'll sometimes go to TriNet and say, hey, I want to do something this way. This is my rationale of why we can do it this way. And hilariously enough, I've had so many conversations with my rep Jennifer where she's like, your rationale makes sense, but I'm going to need to double check that for you. Like, just because a lot of the things we do are so new. Probably the most recent example is California rolled out a sexual harassment training requirement. And we kind of looked at it from, okay, how can we, again, make this consistent? Because it doesn't seem correct to only have a couple of our employees who just happen to live in that state undergo that. Also, usually when California starts something, other states follow suit, such as Washington, Oregon, New York, usually will do something similar. So it's also about how can we also get ahead of this, because this could be coming to other states and it'll just be kind of messy to like roll it out later. So what we do are blanket policies. It's like, okay, this state is requiring this just to make sure everybody's up to par. We're just going to have everyone do the training. And we specifically picked the manager level training because our thought was, well, what if one of you moves into a leadership role? You would have to not only take this 1 hour training, you would have to take another 2 hour training. So let's not do that. We're just going to have you do it, get it done, and then everybody's in compliance, and then we don't have to worry about it. We did the same thing with sick leave. Like, I think it was either California or Washington that enacted it first, or maybe it was Oregon. One of those states. It's usually one of those four: California, Oregon, Washington, New York. And we're just like, well, we're not just going to give a few people this benefit because they just happen to live in this state. So that's why we also made a blanket policy where, like, in the US, everybody's going to get this, because it just doesn't make sense to, not do it this way. And then again, back to the consistency thing, it's not a requirement in Canada, but then they also have their own set of benefits that kind of offset that. And then contractors, we can't give it to them, but because we bill them at a monthly rate, right? If they need to take a day off or two in between to take care of themselves, they're still, quote, getting paid, right? But it's not technically a sick day. So that's kind of how we figured out how to work around, these different things, but then also make it very clear when we roll things out, this is why we're doing it. This is what we're trying to accomplish. This is why it's important. So that's kind of the approach that I take a lot of pride in, because I'm like, I don't think it's enough to just say, well, throw my hands, legally we can't do that. And I'm like, can we though? Can we figure out kind of a way to make this work? I want to see if we can.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it sounds like you guys are on top of whatever new development is happening. Do you proactively check for this? A little bit of context. Obviously, I live in Germany. I don't watch American news too often. Would that be something that's on the news? Do you have maybe a resource you want to share, whether it's like an HR blog, something where you just become aware of these policy changes so that you can stay ahead?
Yeah, so that's where our HR provider is worth its weight in gold. It is impossible for me to single-handedly do all of the parts of my job in addition to staying up on all the state and federal updates and regulations. And so that's essentially what they take care of. So if there's a change in something, they let me know, hey, this is happening. This is how it's going to affect you. And sometimes if it just looks like legal jargon, I'm like, does this actually affect anyone in my company? And sometimes they'll come back with, yes, it's going to affect these 3 employees. So then I can let them know that it's coming. Or they're like, oh no, like this actually doesn't affect you, so don't worry about it. So just having that inside person who can tell me yes or no if I need to like think about something. And then we also do yearly reviews where they let me know things are coming. So like the sexual harassment one, for instance, I knew about that back in, I believe, January or February. And so this was already baked in to our year-long plan. And then we decided, oh, well, if it's required by the end of this year, I'm just going to bake it into our open enrollment and just let them know, like, we're just going to get this all done in 1 month. You'll just buckle down, do it, and then you don't have to think about it. So kind of having that resource has saved me so much time, so many headaches. Now for larger companies that have like, an actual HR department, that's fine. They have people who are experts who can look at those items, that it's not an issue. So yeah, it's a lot, but they keep me sane.
Okay. To give context here, Olark has about 30 employees, right? That's when we refer to you guys are not that big, but you're also not that small either. So
correct. Yes.
The context of your team, the people ops team, is you, Mandy, and that's it, right?
Correct. And
right.
then
so
we have, yes. And then we coordinate with a finance firm, our lawyers, and TriNet. So it's 2 people internally, and then we have 3 agencies that we work with.
Okay. And one of the things you would definitely recommend is, whether it's a smaller or a larger company, to make sure you are set up properly with those or not specifically those, but with external providers to, kind of keep your administrative efforts in check a little bit.
Correct. My thought is it's a trade-off. You're either going to need to invest internally, right? But the complication becomes, it's one thing if, let's say, you have people in maybe a couple of states and then maybe like a bulk of contractors in, I don't know, Argentina, for instance. The more you start expanding your remote scope of multiple states, multiple countries, if you're starting to look at maybe we want a business nexus in another country, that's when you have to start thinking about, it's not just we give everybody Zoom, we give everybody Slack, done, right? Mm-hmm. It becomes more legally complicated. And so that's something to think about if your vision is we want to give people, we want to source candidates from anywhere. We want the best talent. We want them to be able to move if they want to, because that's one of our policies is, for instance, we were talking about limitations, right? If you're a US employee, you can move to whatever state you want. That's fine. We have like a process you have to go through and get it, of course, approved. But for instance, being able to move out of country, like you can't maintain your employee status. We're too small. Like that is something that if is even breathed, I'm like, this is something you need to think about, that the employee status, like it's too expensive for us to try to like legally maintain an employee outside the US. Okay. So,
and the people that would like to, sorry to interrupt, but the people that would like to travel, I remember we spoke about this last time, you have a cutoff, right? Do you say you can be out of the country for how many days is it?
183 days is the absolute max. Okay. And when they're thinking about, doing this, it is a process they have to go through. They do need to get it approved by their manager because we do expect them to maintain the same level of output that they would just working from their home. So there's a lot of things that we outline. There's security requirements that I partnered with our security engineer and said, okay, what is an absolute must that they need to do? And then, so we have both a requirements and a recommendations thing, because since we are not sending them, right, we're not sending them to like, Croatia for a business deal, right? They are, traveling of their own accord. We do have them go through this process to get it approved. And we also have them sign a waiver because since we did not send them, like we don't have any business reason for them to be there. So
they would not be insured through you, correct? So if I wanted, to feel safe and be insured in Colombia or Chile or whatever country maybe I'm traveling to, they would have to obviously have their own travel insurance, foreign country insurance, and you guys are out.
Yes, and that's all laid out, to check with their insurance provider, because some do. They offer travelers insurance that maybe you could sign up for. But that is on them to figure out because, again, since we are not sending them there, they're choosing to travel of their own accord. That releases us of liability. So, and that's something we make super clear, or at least I do whenever I talk to them, of being like, we need you to be very aware of this. Just mainly because after having, extensive conversations with both our lawyers and our finance firm, that is kind of the happy medium that we figured out of just like, this is how we can allow you to do this. These are the considerations. But then the crazy thing too is because remote is so new still, even though it's been around like maybe over a decade, maybe longer, like legally, like tax laws hasn't really caught up to it yet. So in some senses, like we have this policy, but we're very cognizant of the fact that things can still change and the policy itself may need to adapt because as different countries, states, local, everything kind of keeps sorting itself out, it could change again, right? And that's why, again, having those experts, who it's their job to stay on top of those you know, those updates and changes, like they become, you know, some of your best allies to ensure that, you know, you're not opening the business up for risk, that the employee isn't opening themselves up to risk unknowingly. Because usually what happens is most people have really good intentions. They're not malicious. They're not trying to, you know, do bad things, right? But sometimes like not having that knowledge, you know, not understanding how things work, you know, they could unknowingly be doing something that's going to open themselves up to risk.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think it's also one of those things when you are employed by a company. And I remember this, I was sent to the US by a German company to open their office there. And we had a great HR person as well. Shout out to Catherine. She, you know, figured out that's because for us, it was the first time for someone to go overseas. And she had to figure exactly those things out. And I was sent, you know, so it was a different situation. But it's definitely also, as an employee, you kind of rely on your company and the resources that they have, meaning, is it a lawyer? Is it, you know, like an HR provider to sort of make sure that you are covered. And I think with remote, you're stretching it a little bit further, whereas a people ops expert and obviously a culture builder and, you know, being there for the team to also manage the expectation, right? Yes. Whether it's when someone is hired or just, you know, when you close an office and like, hey, we're fully remote now. I suppose, you know, everyone in Olark is pretty stable. You're not a bunch of digital nomads that travel across the globe the entire time. But I think some people that are now getting into remote work have that expectation, and keeping that in check a little bit and being very clear, maybe writing a handbook. I think that was one of those great takeaways that you just sort of threw out there. It's like, oh, by the way, this handbook that I wrote. But I think that's actually something that is a really important piece of educating internally and just making very clear, you know what, yes, we have flexibility. We have a very clear remote policy. This is what it is. We require output, but maybe we also require time availability, right? To say, hey, you know, we need an overlap or something right. to get you for an hour a day. And I think that's something that a lot of people that are new to remote still have to learn, is to know that it doesn't mean whenever, wherever, you know, complete freedom, because there still are processes that need to be followed.
Correct. And I do think it really is on the business to make those clear, because one of the things is, you know, I did gloss over the handbook. I've spent a lot of time and on the handbook. And also, for instance, whenever I work with, you know, our lawyers, they'll put all this legalese. I'm like, all right, can you rewrite this for like a human, like a normal human to read? Mm-hmm. You know, and then like, oh, right. And so then they'll, you know, make it a little bit more user friendly. And whenever I onboard anybody new, I specifically walk through the policies and show them and recommend to them, you know, for the first week, I highly recommend you dive into these, read them, especially if you're really interested, for instance, in working remotely, understanding what the expectations are. Because when it comes down to it, again, like this is why some of our policies, we explicitly put in an approval process, because it's like, nope, you can't just go to another country and work from there. Right? You know, there are things like security, for instance, is huge, right? It's like we need to make sure that you're protecting yourself and the company, because since you are working, like our information is on there. Yeah. And so, you know, for us, we want to balance that. Yes, we want to give you flexibility, lean into that remote first, but definitely that transparency, expectation, and process have to be super clear. And, you know, when this policy was initially put into place, as actually quite a few of our remote policies, it came down to one of our employees being like, can I go work in Argentina or I think it was Chile for 3 months? I'm like, I think so. And that's kind of what, you know, started the ball rolling. And so again, because remote is still so new, you know, questions are going to come up. And I think being super adaptive and being open to those questions can actually lead to really great policies. Because for those who have actually taken advantage of our working remotely and our co-working, specifically now the extension with the co-living portion of it, mm-hmm. They've gotten so much out of working remotely, but also with, you know, that security of like, I know it's expected of me. I'm not going to get, you know, in trouble. I know what I need to do, because we definitely put in there, like, if you have a tax person, check with your tax person, like, let them know what's going on. Just make sure you're not opening yourself up to risk inadvertently. You know, same thing when we were looking at adding co-living to our co-working policy. You know, one of the things that I have them do is like, I need to see the agreement that you're going to sign before you even sign it, right? Yeah. Because I've come across some where I look at them like, did you read this section? This looks really sketchy. I don't think you can't sign this. Like, no, the company will likely not pay for this, right? And so it's one of those things too, that I also like to point out. Yes, it's policy. Yes, it's process, adaptive, but you also need to have somebody running it, you know, being in charge of it, managing it, because again, it could change at any time. Like co-living, I didn't even know that was a thing until like a year ago.
Yeah. And
one of our employees asked, like, can I get reimbursed for this? I mean, it's kind of like, I mean, it is co-working. I just am in another country. Is that cool? And I'm like, what the heck is co-living? I don't even know what that is. And so then I looked into it, and, you know, we figured out a policy and process that worked for us. But again, that was only maybe a year and a half ago that this came up. So remote is constantly changing. So having that internal person who not only, you know, can manage it, but is also excited about it too, because my enthusiasm for remote knows no bounds. The fact that it's like this new frontier of possibilities for, you know, business practices, for company culture, how things can be run, it's exciting. And so having a person who's comfortable with ambiguity and questions and not always having the answer right away. There's so many times where, you know, I've been asked questions where I'm like, you know, I think I might know the answer, but I'm going to look into this a little bit more and I'm going to come back to you in a bit. Like being okay with that, being okay with not having an answer, and then being really excited to find out what that answer is, or seeing if in some senses after doing this for quite a while, I'm like, okay, I think this is how it's going to go. I think this is what I'm going to need to do, but I'm just going to like quickly do a little legal check with like our lawyers or something. And then for them to come back saying, yeah, this actually makes sense, is kind of one of my own little like victory dances where I'm like, yeah, I'm starting to maybe get a handle on like how remote is functioning, since really, again, it's so new, right? So it's exciting for me as somebody who likes these types of challenges, but for somebody who maybe is a little bit more regimented, likes things as, you know, black or white, yes or no, kind of managing these type of processes and building these foundations for a remote company might not be a good fit. So that's something I suggest when hiring, is specifically for somebody who's going to be doing your HR, hiring, you know, anything related to people ops, looking for that quality of adaptability and being excited by being able to uncover things, experiment, try things, and most importantly, not being afraid to throw something out if something's not working, right? Be like, well, that's just like our offices, right? They weren't working anymore, you know, low attendance, they kind of were a money suck. And so over time, we're like, this doesn't make any business sense. Like we should just close these down, and that's okay. You know, and then from it, I ended up getting all of this experience of going through that process, which it was difficult, but I wouldn't have traded it for anything, because it was such a unique, you know, experience to add to my already growing Rolodex of like remote, you know, newness that's so exciting for me.
And you definitely have become an expert. And I think that was really one of the like perfect segues to what I wanted to conclude with, which is the recommendation of like hire someone who's great at people ops and who's great at embracing that excitement and the uncertainty that comes with remote working. Definitely as one of the recommendations is like, yes, if you want to go fully remote, you need someone to handle that kind of stuff. You can't just expect it to run on its own. And yeah, I think we've perfectly shown that you have learned a lot in 5 years at Olark, that you have become an expert for the US, for Canada, but clearly also handling contractors around the world. And I know that you're speaking at 2 events this summer, but late summer. And I wanted you to tell us again because I forgot, but please tell me. I know one is virtual, so I can catch you. The other one I probably won't make.
Yes. So a couple of things coming up, which is super exciting. So Rebel and Connect is having a virtual event on August 13th. So talking about all things remote, it's a great space to meet other remote professionals as well, and thrilled to be speaking there. And then also I'll be speaking at the Support Driven Leadership Summit in Boston. That's going to be from September 26th to the 27th. I'll be specifically focusing on the topic of what do you do when you have an underperforming employee. So kind of an HR framework of how you can both legally and humanely address, this type of very common issue, because as a manager, it's not so much if it happens, but more when it happens. So very, very excited to speak at both events and to also give them a little love because they're doing great things. And yeah, so those are coming up soon.
Amazing. Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to August 13th. I'll be there for sure virtually. Yeah, and I know we spoke about so much. I don't even know what the time is at this point. But yes, I will also write this up in a blog article. So everyone who's still watching, I will definitely write like a little bit of a summary of the main takeaways for a quick read. I'll probably put some links in the comments here or in the description. If anyone has any questions, hello@acework.io is our email address. I'll put my LinkedIn link in there as well. You can reach Kimberly. So we're open to have conversations about the topic, transitioning to remote working, general policy, that kind of stuff. We hope it was useful. I think we're just going to switch the recording off now and
Yes.
do a little debrief.